Good afternoon, and welcome to the Division 47 webinar, Exercise Psychology and Practice, Theory-Based Perspectives to Transforming Exercise Behavior. All participants are muted throughout the webinar. Please use the Questions tab to present any questions. And now we will have an introduction of our speaker by Marina Galante.
Welcome, everyone. This presentation is hosted by APA Division 47, the Society for Sport, Exercise, and Performance Psychology. I'm Marina Galante, and I'm one of two student representatives for Division 47, along with Bree Jones. And on behalf of the division, we'd like to welcome you all to today's event. We have three really amazing presenters today, and we'll leave approximately 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for a question and answer session. So as questions come up during the presentation, feel free to send them in using your webinar control panel. For anyone who's unable to join us today, the webinar will be recorded and posted on the Division 47 website. Finally, Division 47 will be live tweeting during the webinar. So if you're on social media during or after the event, please follow along using the hashtag #ExercisePsych. We're really fortunate to have an amazing panel of speakers agree to take part in today's event. So the presenters today include Jay Kamichik, Dr. Sam Zizzi, and Dr. Linda Keeler. Dr. Kamichik is an associate professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Health at Miami University and is interested in the relationship between optimal exercise and healthy living. Dr. Zizzi is a professor in sport and exercise psychology at West Virginia University, and his scholarship focuses on community-based approaches to physical activity promotion. Dr. Keeler is an associate professor in sport and exercise psychology at Western Washington University, and she is the director of the Western WellCat program, a peer-led physical activity intervention for students with depression. So now I'll hand it over to Jay for the presentation.
Thanks, Marina. Welcome, everyone. Glad you can make it. So each of us are going to go about 15 minutes, and then as Marina said, we'll take questions. I want to acknowledge also Elizabeth Sans, who is a graduate student here at Miami University. And I also want to say that Marina is a former graduate student at Miami University. So I'm going to talk about enhancing the experience with life to optimize and sustain the experience of exercise. It sounds like a mouthful, but what I'm going to do is pretty practical, although some will say I'm not. So I'll start with Hillman and Ventura. A good idea means useful, practical, immediately applicable. Isn't it a shame that we can value ideas only when we have them in harness? So my ideas in these next 15 minutes, I would say would probably give you like the 10,000 foot view, you know, like if you go on Google and you look up an address and you look at it from above, that's probably what I'm kind of doing. And sometimes people think, well, that's not all that practical because you're not on the ground, right? You're not in the real stuff. And I would argue that I think some of the things I'm going to talk a little bit about today are very practical for sport and exercise psychologists as it relates to physical activity. So what am I talking about? Well, really exercise psychology is kind of this reciprocal interaction between activity and our psychological well-being. So you can look at physical activity and how it influences psychological well-being, and you can look at psychological well-being and how it influences physical activity. They go together. I'm really interested in psychological well-being and how it influences our physical activity. So for example, how does our well-being influence exercise motivation and the exercise experience? So the story basically goes like this. Exercise, physical activity is good for us. People are rational, so we should focus on changing their behavior. How do we do that? We change their thoughts and beliefs about the behavior. Once they do that, they'll feel better, they'll feel good, they'll keep doing it, and reduce our risk for disease, and we all shout out, yay. And as you'll see, and as you probably have experienced for yourself, not so fast. And again, the data is all over the place. You probably have seen this in your classes, in your practice, in the journals, so on and so forth. We still have some challenges. Obviously, in this country, we have many challenges, but physical activity is one of them. And as you can see from this data, and again, you've got these slides, so I'm not going to go into detail, but generally speaking, we are in an active culture for the most part. Now, so we've tried interventions. We've tried interventions using various ideas about thoughts and feelings and beliefs and so forth. And again, I'm not saying those interventions aren't useful or haven't been helpful, but in general, if you go and look at all ages, all groups, we struggle with having our interventions help people sustain physical activity. And we keep saying more as it relates to some of these ideas. Now, why in the long run might that not be the route to go? Well, one, people need a different life orientation and skill set for sustaining behavior change, right? So what you need to sustain is different from what you need to start, right? We've been narrowly kind of grounded in these rational cognitive models, right? Most behavioral variation unaccounted for. And Dr. Ekakakis at Iowa State has really been a leader in this area in terms of kind of critiquing our approaches. And so, you know, against kind of common sense, we probably have focused too much on the specific behavior such as physical activity and what we think about it. So that's kind of why we maybe have not been as successful as we want. And so when you think about it, you know, and think about your own behavior as I'm going through this as far as it relates to physical activity. What's missing, right? What's missing from this? Well, it's the person and the experience. And you might go, duh, but this is really significant because if you look at how humans are, we are holistic beings. So we have conscious and subconscious, which means you can't just look at conscious thoughts and beliefs and think we're going to change people's behavior. And George Kelly, a psychologist, you know, many years ago said, there must be something more than emotion, thought, and behavior that goes to make us up, right? And so what is that? It's our experience. It's the subjective experience, the lived experience. So again, you may have thoughts and beliefs, but is that really your experience? So what does it feel like to be me? Would be a question. And you don't want to be me, but I kind of can tell you what it feels like to be me, right? What does it feel like to move my body? That gets into subjective experience. And again, this isn't necessarily anything new per se, but it's a missing thing when we're talking about sustaining physical activity. So Dr. Oz, right? People change based on what they feel. Jane Brody, it's how these activities make me feel. A definition of health, a person's subjective experience of being in a positive state of well-being. So this gets into kind of areas of phenomenology and existential phenomenology, which sounds kind of highfalutin philosophy, but it's really not. It's just like right now we all are having an experience. And what does that experience feel like? That's a crucial element to helping people be more physically active. And so to sustain a behavior, especially one of a volitional or voluntary nature, like physical activity for the most part, we must optimize the person and the experience. And people are like, oh, it's okay, yeah, but how do we do that? And again, this relates to sustenance, right? What is sustenance? A source of strength, nourishment, a being supplied with the necessaries of life. So what are the necessaries of life? Right? Or in Jungle Book, right? What are the bare necessities? Well, I can't draw on the computer, but Elizabeth can. And so she helped me out a little bit. If you're talking about well-being, right? If I'm saying that we have to focus on the experience of the person, right? Well, what are the main things that would drive our physical activity? And some would argue there's four, there's probably more, but some significant people have said eudaimonia, flow, biophilia, and autonomy are innate needs that humans have. And I know Linda's going to talk a little bit more about self-determination theory, which is kind of where autonomy comes from. But those are crucial elements of us, right? So those things drive what we do. They're innate needs that we have, right? So the model basically shows how, look, if you can feel autonomy and flow and biophilia and eudaimonia, you have more motivation and energy, and you're more likely to exercise. So this would be kind of considered to be, you know, helping people the more natural way, so to speak, right? Because you're feeding into the experience of the person and the experience of the behavior. And again, this might be considered to be something like positive subjective experience or positive optimal experience, whatever it might be. So all I'm saying is that if you want to, in your practice or in looking at the research, if you want to help people be more physically active, it's pretty hard to do unless you address the basic psychological needs that we all have. So that's basically what my argument or what my suggestion is. So again, you probably have run across these things in readings and literature and so forth, and I'm not going to get into all the details of what these things are, but eudaimonia really involves more of a personal expressiveness. Flow is that total engagement, right? That's been around a long time as well. I'm not going to get into autonomy and biophilia today, but I'm going to focus in the rest of the time I have focusing on kind of eudaimonia and flow as why these are significant aspects of physical activity. So again, a lot of words here, but basically it's just suggesting that eudaimonic well-being is very much connected to physical activity. Positive purpose, right, is connected to physical activity. They show that older adults become more physically active for those who are high in eudaimonic well-being, and you can't get away from the quality of the physical activity experience. So this idea of eudaimonia, I know it's been a term that's kind of coming more frequent now, and people don't know how to say it or understand it, myself included, but it seems very significant, and it's a part of us. It's a part of our natural way of being. The same thing with flow. The idea is that we have an innate need to be engaged in our experience. And again, flow has been connected to physical activity. So again, perhaps being a little repetitive, maybe optimally redundant, is that if you want to help people be physically active, you cannot escape the innate needs that we have. If you don't include those, sustenance is not going to be found. We're going to keep trying to help people begin and not sustain. So some practical things, in my view, practical things to consider. Look, most types of amounts of exercise, people aren't necessarily jumping up and down saying, yes, I want to exercise, because they don't always feel good when they move their bodies, right? And affect is an important part of that process. And so ultimately, as far as practical things to consider, you have to consider pleasure and meaning they have to get some enjoyment from the experience itself, and it has to mean something. Again, this sounds kind of commonsensical, but we haven't really included a lot of that in many of the interventions that have been done with individuals and communities and so forth. So I would say, do we have to start with the behavior? Right? And that might go against the grain of exercise psychology, where we want to start with the behavior. I'm not sure it's necessary all the time to start the behavior. So kind of on the end run here, as far as what you might want to think a little bit about, if when I work with individuals or I'm in class or I'm students, I basically ask them questions, right? You start with the person of interest, not the behavior of interest, right? So what is this person's personal expressiveness? How do you like to express who you are, right? How do you engage in what you do, right? Where does your interest go, right? That would be flow kind of question. What makes this person feel free? So really, it's a very powerful kind of thing. I feel free when. And again, this individual may not write, I feel free when I'm moving my body. But the point is, it gets them to start connecting themselves to the mind and the body. And then biophilia is this idea of connecting with nature. And so how does or can this person connect nature and the outdoors? We've done some work. There's many other studies like this, but we basically took a group of employees and we said, let's try to help them with their well-being and see what happens. They started to walk more. Again, it wasn't a study designed to increase physical activity, but compared to a control group, the group that was in the eudaimonic enhancement process started to move more, right? So these are some ways you might want to think a little bit about with this kind of, 10,000 foot view of how can we work with individuals, which may then kind of transfer over to moving their bodies more. So last couple of slides. So why focus on well-being? Well, basically the bottom line would be The more you can feel being personally expressive or having interest or feeling free or connected, the more energy you have. Now, why is this crucial? Because it takes energy to achieve optimal experience. So without the energy, it does not matter what kind of thought or affect-based interventions we throw at people. And again, I don't say this lightly. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but if we don't include the missing ingredients of well-being, our success is probably going to be less. Because what do people do when they have this well-being energy? They will more naturally move their bodies. They'll feel sustenance. So not this kind of energy that comes from various things which energize information. That's not sustainable. This is the kind of energy that is more sustainable. The informed energy, the energy that comes out of eudaimonia and flow and autonomy and biophilia. That's the kind of energy that I think Csikszentmihalyi, the flow guru, is kind of talking about that people need, right? And if we do that, people will feel more like this. And my daughter was involved in a program at Ohio State where they took kids into this summer camp, and she was interviewing them as part of her study. And this one girl just said, look, I felt like an eagle in the sky. I was running and my hair was flowing back because of my braids, but it was like the air was going up on my scalp and I was just going. And I saw people pass me, but it was like, I didn't care. I'm doing this. That's all that mattered. Everything else just slowed down and I could focus on myself. It felt like I was on top of the world. And I'm not saying that when people exercise, they feel like they're on top of the world. But when we include eudaimonia and flow and autonomy and biophilia into that process, we're more likely to have people sustain their physical activity, not only for themselves, but in their communities as well. So that's all I have for my 15 minutes of fame. And we're going to go over now to Sam.
Hello, everyone. This is Sam Zizzi coming from Morgantown, West Virginia. Appreciate you guys tuning in. And Jay, thanks so much for the handoff. Enjoyed listening to that. I'm going to try to bring us down a few thousand feet. And hopefully now you can see what's going on with my slides. Hopefully it's squared away. I'm going to talk specifically today about mindfulness-based approaches to exercise behavior change and how we might be able to adopt some of the specific concepts and principles from the theory and some of the research that's been done in mindfulness and acceptance-based approaches, and how that might affect this specific change process when you're working with clients who are trying to change their exercise behavior. One of the things I want to do to more formally introduce myself is talk about some of the experiences I've had, because it's very important for me that everything I'm sharing with you coming in context and my own experiences. So I've been in sports psych now for about 20 to 25 years. Good portion of that has been doing exercise psychology work in communities, specifically community-based interventions, after-school programs, faith-based organizations, and also in fitness centers around the state of West Virginia. If you're familiar at all with health statistics, West Virginia likes to distinguish itself regularly as one of the heaviest states. We are all one of the oldest states, one of the poorest states. So we do have a lot of work here in the state of West Virginia, and my colleagues and I enjoy doing that work. I've also, in the last 10 years or so, gotten involved in some public health work that's more related to evaluation of programming and policies as well. So I've sort of come out to more of a macro perspective from the individual. However, related mostly to this talk, I have a bit of expertise in health behavior counseling, and I've written a few book chapters in that area. I've included some of those references, and you're welcome to follow up with me on that. Related to the mindfulness piece, my colleague Mark Anderson and I, good friend and colleague, did publish an edited book last year that focused on the intrapersonal and interpersonal benefits of mindfulness. And I think this will be highly relevant for psychologists who are in the audience, because it does take the perspective really of developing a mindful approach to therapy. So key question for today and my portion of the talk is, how can we adapt some of this mindfulness theory and research to your work with exercise clients, because carrying on from Jay's work, oftentimes they don't necessarily have great success in pursuing goals of being more physically active. So how can we take a bit of a different approach? In terms of mindfulness, I think most people would be quite exposed to it at this point. It does have two pieces to really consider. That is bringing your energy and attention into the present moment. So it's sort of where that's happening, and then there's a particular quality to the attitude once you're in that present moment. Today I'm going to focus mostly on the attitude and the qualities of that attitude, specifically lack of judgment, so a non-judgmental approach, being open and curious, and then also this element of self-compassion. And if we were able to cultivate that in some of our clients, how might that change how they're approaching the process? So in people that I've worked with out in communities, these are some examples of the types of behaviors that they would be pursuing. Walking more regularly, such as trying to walk 3 days a week, 5 days a week, every day, trying to meet a step goal, as Jay had in his presentation. Perhaps maybe standing more, moving more while they're at work. A lot of people that we work with in West Virginia have sedentary jobs. I'm sure that would be true of many of the people you might be exposed to, or some of your clients in therapy, the same. Perhaps they're pursuing some sort of structured gym program or trying to go to a gym. This is often quite a difficult thing for people to navigate for a variety of reasons. One, because there's often travel and commute to get to that location. And then also sometimes they're not finding great purpose or any sort of reason on why they would be there. It can be sort of an unfamiliar environment. One caveat also is that much of my work has been in weight management. So sometimes I get myself mixed up when I'm doing an exercise psychology talk, is that I'm going to do my best to focus mostly on physical activity behavior today. But almost all the clients that we would work with would also have some sort of dietary goals, such as caloric restriction to lose weight, perhaps changing macro or micronutrients, reducing sodium, sugar, for example. And so it would be common, I think, if you're working with somebody on their health behaviors, for them to be addressing more than one of those things. So before I get a little bit into the nuts and bolts of the change process, I do want to stop for a second, and let's not forget that much of the evidence in terms of becoming a mindful practitioner, being a mindful therapist, suggests that the biggest benefits for mindfulness are happening in the place where you're consulting or working with your client. So the idea of cultivating a particular attitude, being curious, open, having that unconditional positive regard, may allow you to basically be in flow with your client, using the fancy words here of attunement and resonance that come out of the mindfulness literature. And so if you were able to become a bit more mindful and model that with the clients, it is highly likely that you'll have a changing dynamic with your clients, and that may lead to some sort of unexpected or different qualities of those sessions. I will point to a very useful resource if you haven't come across it yet, a book by Siegel entitled The Mindful Therapist. So I don't want to forget that piece, because it's not so much what we do in the session sometimes, but it can often be about how we are, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with that. Getting a bit more into the micro level here, I'm adopting a model that was put out by Pallavi and Herman a little over 15 years now, making me slightly feel old. The idea that usually people set very unrealistic goals about their physical activity habits. They will go then through a cycle of weeks or months. They will eventually fail at achieving those goals. They may have some sort of negative reaction to that failed attempt. There'll be some sort of negative mood or affect, and then they'll make a faulty attribution such as, I could have never done this before. It's too hard for me. These goals are too high anyway. And then the cycle sort of repeats itself. It's called false hope syndrome in their literature. But the idea here is, what if clients from the beginning approach the process quite differently? Not something they should do, not something they have to do, not a particular outcome orientation. And then what if, when they encountered failure along the way, which they're bound to, they're going to miss an appointment at the gym, they're going to not have the energy to be physically active that particular day. And if they evaluated that instead as information, and they were a bit more kind to themselves, how might that change the process? So here we're really looking at the specific component of self-compassion, which is not necessarily mindfulness itself, it's just a subcomponent of mindfulness. How might this break this cycle up? So there is some good work out there in the realm of self-compassion, and there's some great resources out there for practitioners and for clients as well. The idea here is it's really could be the yang to the yin of perfectionism. I often see a lot of rigid goals I see a lot of dichotomous thinking when clients are trying to change their physical activity behavior. And then when they don't reach that, there'll be a lot of judgment. So that's sort of the dark side of that perfectionism or the type A behavior pattern, especially present in those people that are highly conscientious, obviously. May also be present in those with high agreeableness as well. They might be trying to please others or you as the therapist or the health behavior counselor. There is some good evidence in the broad mindfulness literature that you can use these sorts of interventions, variety of different types of models, to reduce worry, change people's attitudes, and to help them clarify values. These things fit well, you may recognize, into processes of change from trans-theoretical model, might be used within self-determination context, or whatever other theoretical orientation that you may be practicing from. Additionally, the biggest thing that trips people up in my experience is this sort of worry about if they're doing it right, self-blame, self-criticism, and the idea of being diffused from those thoughts, that that's not actually the reality, that you're just reacting, and those are just thoughts you're having about that particular day or that particular week in your process of change. That can be a very helpful way that people can learn to be self-compassionate. So then using that process, if they can be encouraged or given permission in some cases to be self-compassionate, they may be able to disengage a bit from these unattainable goals, perhaps something they think they have to do or they're feeling a lack of control over. And that may allow them to then adopt a bit more of a mastery approach, which could change the cycle in this particular way. They would then, from the very beginning, be able to modify their goals. So an example here might be someone who's targeting walking behavior. So instead of their goal being, I'm going to do 10,000 steps a day, or I'm going to do 30 minutes a day, so I can meet physical activity guidelines by making at least 5 days a week, they might start off with something ridiculously low, 5 minutes of walking per day. So we might start them on something that is, they're going to be almost frustrated by the fact that it's too easy. But there's a couple different reasons this might work, might build their self-efficacy. Number one, it seems highly possible that they can achieve that on a given day. They can do it in a variety of ways. It's a highly flexible goal that they could do at home or at work, even on a tremendously busy day, when their kids had crazy schedules, or when they had to go work a crazy schedule, or take care of other people in their schedule, which is a common thing amongst working adults, as you know. But then they may meet that. They may decide they walk 10 to 15 minutes that particular day. They had perhaps an improved mood. There's some great research out there suggesting that 10 to 15 minutes of walking or any sort of equivalent activity might change your energy and your tension levels for 2 to 4 hours. So you can get a nice change in your affective experience. You can improve your quality of life for that particular moment. So they have less negative affect. And then perhaps they're encouraged by us, those are the people that are working with us, to think about that process in a different way. So maybe they come back to 2 weeks later to the next session with us, and they're excited to tell us about the times they screwed up and they couldn't get to the gym. And yeah, I walked 5 minutes at home and it was okay. And the next day I went back and I got on my schedule. So it becomes less of an all or none situation. And they are able to have some positive experiences in there. Maybe they got to 70 or 80% of their goals, and they're able to feel really better about that process, knowing that this is a long-term lifestyle, sustained lifestyle change, as opposed to a diet or a program, walk 100 miles in 100 days, those sorts of short-term programs that are often offered all around the way. So the idea here is that two things. One, introducing the concept of self-compassion, asking if that's something they might be willing to do, maybe exploring difficulties they may have with that, or maybe difficulties from previous attempts to change their physical activity behavior, and then talk them through this process so they can build up the staircase in a very, very slow fashion so that they can start to identify what might work for them and build up from the bottom, as opposed to trying to reach a high standard from the beginning. I think there's significant mood-related benefits of this, and I think there's also a lot of things that they can learn about this set of skills. And I think Jay said it quite well, that it takes a different set of skills and a different orientation to initiate behavior change in physical activity versus sustain it. So this approach may allow us to teach them some of those skills that would help them go that long way. All right, I'd like to pass this over to Dr. Keeler, who's going to finish up the webinar for us.
Okay, thank you, Sam. I'm going to focus in on self-determination theory and habit formation when it comes to exercise. So I'm going to assume that most people have had exposure to self-determination theory, so I'm going to go a little quickly in this area. When we think about the sub-theories of Ryan and DC's model, one of the basic sub-theories is basic psychological needs theory. And just like physical needs, humans need psychological needs. So the physical needs like water, food, shelter. According to Ryan and DC, we also have 3 basic psychological needs. And those psychological needs are relatedness, autonomy, and competence. So relatedness, we have an innate need to have a sense of belonging or connection with others. The opposite of that would be feeling isolated or having a lack of representation or feeling judged. We also have a basic need to feel autonomous or have autonomy. So we don't like to be controlled. So we want to have some kind of self-governance or free will. And if we don't have choices, then we at least want our behavior to be aligned with our value system. So we don't want to be coerced either by our internalized thoughts about others' perceptions or by actually coerced by others. The other thing that we want to have is, or we seek, is a need for competence. We don't like doing things that we don't feel competent at. So we try to, this need, if it's satisfied, we have a sense that we can successfully do a task. Mastery would fall in line with competence. The opposite of it would be feeling overwhelmed or learned helplessness. These 3 needs are found cross-culturally, although interpreted a little bit differently. And they're found in multiple areas: love relationships, work, school, sport, physical activity. And Ryan and DC, they're constantly looking to see if there's a 4th psychological need. And to play off of what Jay was saying, one of the 4th need that might be coming up, according to Ryan from the last conference, was a need to be in the environment or outside. So that might be on the horizon. I encourage anyone, if you want more information, to go to the self-determination theory.org website, which is listed down there for more references. Okay, so how do the 3 needs relate to motivation? When you have a situation where the 3 psychological needs are fulfilled, then you're going to have intrinsic motivation. And this is when growth is maximized as well as general well-being. So something that might be interesting to some of you that are more interested in the external regulations and the different motivation types is that when you are continuing, let's say, exercising, but not all of the basic psychological needs are fulfilled, then there must be at least one additional regulation present. So for chronic exercise or someone who's doing it long term, they might have intrinsic motivation, but then often they have integrated regulation or identified regulation. So autonomous types of motivation might be supplementing their intrinsic. For people who aren't exercising or for people who start and stop, you might see more evidence of introjected or external, what we think of as controlled motivation. On the flip side, if a person is predominantly driven by controlled motivation, let's say their only goal is to lose weight, or they exercise because they feel guilty about what they ate, or to change their appearance, then we know one of their basic psychological needs is probably being undermined or actively being blocked. And again, I encourage you to seek out some more information from Self-Determination Theory, the listserv or their Facebook page, because they post helpful graphics like this one that can show you the interaction between the motivation types and autonomous motivation and controlled motivation. Okay, what I'm going to focus on is applying SDT to larger scale programming interventions and exercise leadership. So first, if we're thinking about community-based programs or reaching out to a certain target population, one of the things that you can do is structure your intervention to fulfill the 3 needs of your target population. So to do that for relatedness, you can focus on social support, and there's all different types of social support out there. One of the things you can do is have them have a companionship support by actually giving them a workout buddy, creating an inclusive and diverse environment, expressing empathy and warmth. For autonomy, you want to build autonomous motivation. So how do we do that? Well, encourage someone to select an activity that they actually enjoy, have them tune into the intrinsic benefits of that activity. If it's more of an exercise prescription situation and you have to give them a prescription, at least give them the rationale for why you chose those activities so that they can buy in their value system. And then for competence, you want to build self-efficacy. So how do you do that? You set realistic task goals regarding frequency, intensity, time, and type. And you provide structure. You might provide education on how to actually do physical activity. So some colleagues and I have implemented a program based on this to target a population of college students with depression. And it's been implemented on 3 colleges, and soon a 4th college is going to start it. But at Western, we call it Western WellCat. And what we do is we've structured the intervention to meet the 3 needs. So for relatedness, what we do is we essentially hire kinesiology students who have a healthy relationship with physical activity, and we pair them up with students with depression. And the students, the interns, aren't personal trainers. They're just essentially the most reliable workout partner you've ever had. And for autonomy, we let the participants pick the physical activity that they're going to do, essentially the when, what, where of the activity. And then for competence, we think for college students, 2 times a week is a doable schedule, and they only do it for 1 hour, and it's 8 to 10 weeks program, and it can be any intensity. So many times it's just they just walk on a trail together for an hour, or it could be that they stretch for a little bit, do some weight training, and then stretch some more. So it's up to the person what they do. The outcomes are pretty outstanding for this program. The basic psychological needs for physical activity have been shown to increase both quantitatively and qualitatively. I've given you some quotes from some of the participants. And we know that when you satisfy the basic 3 needs, quality of life and emotional well-being increase, and that's what we found with their depression. Their depression has significantly decreased, as well as their distress. The other thing that was pretty surprising is that we have an incredible retention rate. We were hovering around 94%, so maybe only 1 person each time drops out. So it's a pretty great adherence rate. A former intern turned grad student actually had the insight and follow through to look at what actually happens to the peer assistants, the kinesiology students who we match up, and she found that their basic psychological needs also increased. So that's an interesting additional bonus there. And she found that they increased by both personally, interpersonally, and professionally. And so you can see some of the quotes from the peer assistants that have gone through the program. Okay, so how can you apply the self-determination theory to exercise leadership? I'm talking about maybe group fitness leadership in classes, at gyms, or even personal trainers. Well, you can think about how can I support the 3 basic psychological needs. Even from an exercise adherence consultant coming from a psychologist to client basis, you can think of this as well. So you're looking at task involving supportive, empathy, and warmth. Basically, what makes a good teacher is what you're looking for. What do you want to avoid, which unfortunately is sometimes depicted, in television regarding physical activity, is that you want to avoid pressure or critical feedback or too difficult of a task. Okay. Now, if you're interested in more of the exercise leadership, I encourage you to read some of Brown and Fry's work, because their caring climate literature is really in line with self-determination theory. So let me show you one intervention that was based for exercise leaders on self-determination theory. And this was Edmonds and colleagues in 2008. They did a 10-week cardio combo study. So they taught the leader of the class how to use techniques that were in line with self-determination theory, the 3 basic needs. So some of the techniques, they taught them empathy, how to provide choices during the class, clear expectations, feedback, and they avoided pressure and external rewards. And they compared it to the control group leader, which was just a bland leadership style, so not really controlling, just a typical control group. So what they found was, sure, after 10 weeks of doing a cardio combo class, even with a bland leader, you would probably increase your competence because of physical practice. But for the self-determination taught leader, they saw a whole much more increase in terms of better outcomes. So increased relatedness, increased competence, more positive affect, and better attendance. So if we think about the outcomes that we want to see for long-term physical activity, I was more in line with those. So for self-determination theory, one of the things that you can think about is less of trying to get people to love exercise and working on a motivational angle. Instead, structure the program to meet the 3 basic needs, and intrinsic motivation will come. And for those of you who are interested more in how it relates to the regulation types, short-term physical activity tends to have a positive relationship more with identified regulations. So these would be your task realistic goals. And I imagine that's increasing if someone was able to hit those goals, like Sam was saying, you're increasing your sense of competence anyway. And then you're only really going to see long-term physical activity if you tune into those intrinsic immediate psychological benefits that both of them have addressed. And that's when you can turn into habit. So let's talk a little bit about habit. Switch gears a little bit. I want to thank Sean Fitzpatrick for turning me into or tuning me on to this subject in these readings. So the basic theory is that to form a habit, I can I can work with a client and they set great goals and they have intrinsic motivation, but how do we actually turn it into a habit? So I'll often talk about this towards the end of sessions with clients. So the habit loop is you have a cue, and when that cue happens, you do a routine, and then you get some reward from that routine. And if you do that enough times in a row, then the next time that cue comes up, you'll start craving the routine. So an example of this, you wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth. The reward is that you have clean feeling, fresh teeth. And if you do that enough times in a row, next time you wake up, you're going to start craving to brush your teeth. And it becomes automatic. In fact, it probably feels odd not to do it. Okay, so if we look at the morning jogger, they wake up, they're feeling groggy, they go for a morning jog, they notice they feel alert and awake, so those intrinsic benefits, right? And they do this enough times it becomes habit. So the next time they wake up, then they're going to start craving that morning jog. And that's when it becomes a habit and it's harder to not do than do. So what if you've already created a habit that is one that you want to change, or it's a sedentary habit, you want to change it to an active habit? Well, let's take the example of someone who works in an office. They have lunch and they start feeling really tired after lunch. So they, have a habit of going out and getting some kind of peppermint mocha pumpkin deliciousness drink, and they get a spike in energy, and that's their reward. So they do that a couple times, they start craving sweet caffeine after lunch, despite if they're tired or not. So if you want to change that habit, one of the things that you can ask your client is, what else is something you enjoy that could give you the same reward? So what is the reward? The spike in energy, right? So for some people, doing a crossword can give them a little bit of energy, or talking to people in the office can give them energy. For others, and hopefully they're tuned into that 10-minute brisk walk can give them energy. So to change the habit, you would replace the routine with the energy producer that would give you the same reward. So in this example, 10-minute brisk walk. And if you do that enough times, then when you're feeling tired after lunch, the next time you're going to start craving physical activity. Now, to form a habit, the routine has to be paired with the same cue repeatedly until it becomes automatic. And there's different variations of those cues, and they can be a location, a time, an emotional state, so when you're feeling tired or stressed, others' actions, or immediate preceding action, like upon waking or after dinner. And I think that's where I'm going to end up and turn it over to questions at this point.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to all three of you for a fantastic webinar and for everything that you put into this process. The webinar was very informational and I think very useful for both applied practitioners, and there were great research applications as well. So we have about 10 to 15 minutes for the discussion. The attendees sent in some really great questions, so we won't be able to get to all of those, but we'll do our best. Okay. All right, so for Jay, somebody asked from the audience, what are some examples of how a practitioner can make exercise psychology interventions more eudaimonic?
Go read Aristotle. You know, these are the questions that I think is the next phase for a lot of this, and I'm not bowing out on that question, but eudaimonia has a long history, just like well-being and flow. And I mean, I was just reading a study where they did a study of studies and found that well-being has been measured in 99 different ways across hundreds of studies. So to give a blanket response to that question is really hard, and I'm not undermining my own ability there, but I think the fact of just asking the question is really significant, because that's an important question, and I don't think we even ask it enough in terms of what purpose and expressiveness is this person bringing. If I'm a consultant or whatever it might be, right? What gifts is this person bringing that we could build on that would be quote unquote eudaimonic? So eudaimonic, a lot of times they talk about its meaning or purpose, and those things are important, but I really like the personal expressiveness. So what is it in your life that is personally expressive? And if you can't answer that question, you have to go out and touch and feel your life. And again, that might be too high of a view, and Sam and Linda might help me out a little bit if they want, and they can jump in. But that's asking the question is probably more significant than giving a specific example, because it's going to be different for everyone, and that may sound like a cop-out, but that's kind of where I'm at the moment with trying to figure that out.
And I can follow up just a little bit. I think the idea of purpose and identity is important. I think in sports psych, we were very familiar with athletic identity. Most people don't really identify with being an active person when they start, but they might identify to a variety of other things. They might be an amazing teacher or lawyer or mom or dad. So I would say the simplistic answer to this is, if you can figure out what is the most important role or roles in their life, and somehow physical activity could get connected to that role temporarily, to help them sort of be active while being a mom. Now, it at least isn't separate from that. So it probably doesn't address the eudaimonia directly, but if we can at least merge the two together, it would at least help them move up the self-determination scale as well, from more extrinsic to a little bit more intrinsic motivation, because it would become part of their identity as a mom to be a healthy mother, or to be a teacher who promotes physical activity.
Great. Thank you guys for those answers. So the next question for the audience is actually for Sam. So how do you increase self-compassion with your clients, especially those who are particularly self-critical or perfectionistic?
Yeah, it's pretty tough. They've got a pretty good script going on there. So I think laughter is probably the way that I work with them. So, we'll sort of catch them with some of their thoughts, and we'll just laugh at them together. Like, is that really, like, usually those people are quite compassionate to other people. So usually we have these really well-developed muscles of compassion, and we'll care for children and older people and others, but then, we'll treat ourselves terribly. So I think humor is probably the way to first help them develop awareness that, oh man, here I go again. I'm calling myself this, or I am evaluating the process this. What? And just to be interested in that instead of to be judgy of it. So the first part is really to just, wow, why am I doing that? And then let them go home with that and sort of figure that out, because it would be hard to know the answer in the session why that is. They might come back later and figure that out. So I would say humor is a great one, because it's just fun to laugh at themselves. And, we might write out some of these things that they're saying, and they're like, is this the fact of life here? This is these things that you're thinking, or is this just crazy thoughts coming through your mind that maybe don't deserve as much attention as you're giving them? So then they can have a little bit more distance, but they have to have awareness of it first.
And I really like Linda's kind of slides where she talked about the kind of setting up the structure. Like, the more you can set up the kind of social structure to kind of free people up, then they're less likely to judge themselves, I think. I mean, so that setting up that structure, and not necessarily always kind of following self-determination theory, but I think it's a very good model to use, right? You set up a structure where people feel like they're not being judged, and then maybe they're less likely to judge themselves too harshly, right? Because they're feeling more free in that moment. So that could be a little tag on to what Sam just talked about.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. So the next question is for Linda. So you talked about how the Western WellCap program is used as well as not only at your university, but throughout a few different sites. And so what do you see as the future for these types of programs, and how can we make them more accessible?
Well, the first step is my sabbatical in the spring. I'll be working on actually a training packet of how we put together these programs over the multiple sites, and try to standardize the implementation materials that you would need and the steps to take. And then with Dr. Alicia down at St. Edmunds, our plan is to hopefully roll it out for anyone interested. I was at Chico State when we started it there. I helped get it started there. I came to Western, we started here, and then Dr. Alicia started at Humboldt State, and now has moved to Texas, so she's going to start at a different college. So it's just been, based on moves at this point, but really she was interested in applying it at Humboldt, so I just helped her there. So our long-term goal is to, whoever wants to do it, is to be able to help someone and go visit them, start up, do some training, and hand over the materials. So it's a really easy program if you just get it aligned to all the different social agents involved. Yeah. So contact me if you're interested.
Okay, great. So that's an open invitation for audience members. It sounds like. Okay, great. So the next question from the audience is just a broad question, so anybody could answer. The audience member indicates that individuals still consider dietitians and personal trainers when thinking about how to engage in health behavior change. So how should applied exercise psychologists or exercise psychology professionals promote or market themselves to be considered as primary for these types of interventions?
That's a great question. I think what Sam's doing with getting involved in the insurance companies for the state is a huge step. He'll probably talk about that, but also the marketing piece. We need to be involved with some marketers that could actually get us out in the public's eyes. But I think what's really coming down to is aligning with physician groups and health centers on campus and trying to get involved in through the health system. And that way we can get some referrals that way. I bet Sam has something to say about this though.
About most things, probably. I don't know. I've done a lot of work with dietitians and personal trainers. So to me, they're two very different audiences. Dietitians are incredibly well trained in what they do in practicing medical nutrition therapy. So they've been excellent allies, and they usually know what motivational interviewing is, and they have practiced it, read about it. So dietitians, I think, are in a very good space and are trained really well to do what they do. We can be an asset to them. I've done motivational interviewing training for sets of dietitians. Personal trainers, it's sort of the Wild West because you've got certifications that are tiny and don't really teach them anything, and then you have really good credentials within personal training. So I think there's a really good ethical piece there as well in terms of making your role pretty clear, because I really try to stay in my lane with focusing on behavior and mood and not messing with the exercise prescription and not messing with the dietitian's prescription of food, if that's the case, because I've done a lot of stuff with weight and weight management. So I think that's probably the most primary issue. I think otherwise you're going to have to prove value. So to whatever place is you're trying to get employed at or to get a consulting gig, you're going to have to show that your services add value over what they're currently providing. So then you have to figure out how you can do that based on what outcomes might be of value of that organization. I'd be happy to follow up with individual specific questions, but that's ultimately what it means, because businesses are interested in making money. Insurance companies are interested in saving money. So you're going to have to show how the services you're providing, either from health behavior counseling or, for example, program evaluation, is going to do that.
And I think Linda and Sam's points are excellent points. I think sometimes, we've been doing this a long time. We kind of get to think this is kind of really the natural way of doing things. Like when we talk about mindfulness and autonomy and eudaimonia, and like these words come natural to us. But I still think, although it's getting better, having been involved with Miami's employee wellness program for a lot of years, but we can't forget that our society and culture still focuses on exercise as a very kind of physiological thing. And we kind of forget that still drives a lot of the prescriptive process. So I would agree with Sam that you got to be careful as far as the language you use, because it's not necessarily still a mainstream way of looking at behavior change or healthy living. It's still somewhat biomedically driven. And so we just have to be relentless and patient and nice and keep helping people figure that out.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great reframe too. Also talking about that you guys talked about, Sam and Jay, of discussing like how we can add value with working with other professionals instead of necessarily like being the only people that do what we do. So that sounds really great as like an allied professional team. Okay, so next question from the audience is, what are age-related differences regarding exercise? So for example, a couple people in the audience actually asked for specific maybe suggestions for adolescents, younger adults, or older adults with regards to setting goals related to exercise maintenance.
Well, it's a tough one in terms of the exercise prescription. I wouldn't be touching that. I mean, I would be relying on American Heart Association or ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine guidelines, which would be available out there for how much is enough. So I would be relying on those resources, which you could certainly use as a psychologist or as a consultant in this capacity. And then, hopefully you have some sort of training in developmental psychology to understand what the particular age needs are. And then you have a good intake that would be appropriate for the audience. Most of my experiences with 40 and up, 35, 40 and up, all the way through 80s. I don't have a lot of experience doing individual work with youth at all.
There's actually research that shows that if you have the clients set their own goals with your help, they're going to adhere to them more. Plus, it's particularly relating to exercise. If they pick their own time and intensity type, then they tend to pick an intensity that's healthy for them regardless. So I don't encourage people to, outside of let's say, a disease treatment center, I don't suggest exercise prescriptions. Actually, I have them pick their own.
Great point. Well, thank you guys all so much. That concludes our question and answer session. So thanks everybody for joining us today. This webinar was recorded and will be available in the next couple weeks online in the Division 47 website. And lastly, I'd just like to encourage anybody in today's audience to join us at the APA convention this August in Chicago from August 8th through 11th, where there will be several days of really exciting Division 47 programming. So thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to our fantastic panelists. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Marina.
Thanks, Marina. Bye.